So thank you everyone for joining us today for our amazing workshop, Future Thinking, How Will Our Neighbourhoods Share Energy in the Future, which is a very topical question and one that I guess is particularly relevant to Phillip Island and the Bass Coast region as well. Before we continue any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people as the traditional owners of the land on which I am sitting today. And I'm sure, Heather, you've got some other ancestry where you are. But I'd like to also acknowledge the leaders past, present and emerging, and that these lands were never ceded and that we are in the process of treaty, which I think is very exciting as well. So I'd like to introduce Heather, who has very kindly joined us today and is, I think, quite an amazing, I'm a bit of a fan of Heather's. I've been in a couple of workshops and listened to her, so I'm very excited about today. So Heather is an electrical engineer, which, you know, by itself, you don't usually go woohoo, but that leads to more exciting things. An electrical engineer, a policymaker and a Churchill Fellow. So in her third career, she's focused on community energy and our energy transition. So Heather volunteers with Citizens Own Renewable Energy Network Australia, Carina, if I'm saying it correctly, and the Coalition for Community Energy. So two of the organisations in the emerging community energy sector. So Heather is finalising a PhD with UniSA, looking at what it takes to redesign our electricity system. Microgrids and the growing independence of local energy systems is the focus of her research. So thank you, Heather, for joining us today. We're very excited to have you, and I understand you've had a very busy morning already.
Thanks, Zoe.
My pleasure. Now, we will hear a lot from Heather, and hopefully we all share in this discussion to some degree. So I'll just explain the notional format, and again, we're quite informal today, but the plan is that we have a bit of a start, but I think the main thing we're trying to do here is think about where we want to be in 2040, where we want to be in 2030. So I want to pose a question to us all soon to have a little think about. I'll foreground that by saying Totally Renewable Phillip Island, who I'm the coordinator of and who are hosting this event as part of the Sustainability Festival. Our mission really is to be carbon neutral by 2030. And obviously part of that is 100% renewable energy as well. So we've got a lot of exciting things in the works, but we are at the point now in, I almost forget what year it is, 2021, of that future is now tangible. So I want to think about where will we be in 2040, which is, I'm going to call it 18 years away, and where are we going to be in 2030, and I'm going to call that 8 years away. So TRPI's vision, which is supported by the Bass Coast Shire with their climate change action plan to be net zero emissions by 2030. Our mission is to basically reach the future that we want in 8 years, which is quite a challenge. So we've brought Heather here today, and we've brought members of the community so that we can all talk about what we think energy should look like. I know we've had a lot of topical points lately. For instance, last week, where I live in Cape Woolamai, we had a planned power outage on Wednesday and then a storm Thursday night, no power Friday, Saturday. And that sort of is just a reminder of the storms we had back in June that took out a lot of our system as well. And I know I've talked to a lot of you about some of the frustrations of, I guess, in this age of technology where we're all online having meetings, having restricted access at times to electricity supply, to internet, to phone, and basically what can we do about this? So the first question I'd like to say is, and this is before we hear from Heather about really what neighbourhood energy is, because I want, I guess, blue sky thinking. What will 2040, so 18 years away, what will 2040 look like with neighbourhoods sharing energy? Does anyone want to pipe up with some ideas or thoughts? And Heather, you're welcome to as well.
Will we be living in Holocaust bunkers?
Holocaust bunkers. How will we manage our energy then, Bernie?
Well, we won't need very much. Well, maybe a bit for cooling, not much for heating.
Yeah. What about Michael? What do you reckon? 2040, 18 years away. Are we all going to sit in our houses and switch on the PowerPoints and pay our bills? What do you think?
2040. I think that microgrids will become much more of a reality, that the poles and wires system that we have in Australia is not fit for purpose for what we're doing today. And obviously there's issues now that I know we're creating 29 kilowatts a day of electric in the last 3 months. The system that we have won't cope with that. So we need some localized systems that, and I would see, myriad of those happening across Australia by 2040.
Mm-hmm. I love hearing the terminology, but we're going to let Heather sort of take us into a bit more of a dive of what some of these things look like and are in a little while. But anyone else out there, Henry or Ian, do you want to have a little think about 2040 and where you think what we might be looking like? So 18 years away, how old am I? I'll be in my 50-somethings by then.
Ian speaking. Look, I just see communities connected. And I see controls on meters that will ensure that the blackouts are managed. The potential blackouts are managed. But basically, whole communities linked to one another via various means of the grid. But the grid will become more local and quite possibly generation locally as well as energy storage. So it's pretty different to what's here now, but it actually resembles the phone cell arrangement across Australia. It will look similar to that in a way, but certainly wouldn't mirror that. But it's a similar sort of concept. That's the way I see it.
Do you see it all being connected, or are you seeing it in segments, so less with a centralised?
Actually, I hate to say this, but actually both. So Phillip Island, if you've got excess, you will be selling it to the next door community or somewhere else in the state on the wholesale market. If you're low on energy, for instance, during your peak season, you'll be importing it from the next door neighbour community, which could be Wonthaggi or whatever.
That sounds quite efficient to me, which is appealing as well. Henry, Did you want to add some ideas?
Oh, look, I tend to agree with Ian. I think one of the big issues is that the cost of energy should be really, at that stage, rated largely on the maintenance of the system, because there'll be no cost for generation. And I think there'll be mixed storage. There'll be some individual storage and there'll be some sort of large community storage. But I think we'll have each community area, if you like, capable of isolation. And just looking forward to it heading that way and the rules being gradually modified so we actually catch up with where we should be.
And I think, Luke, you've got your hand up. Did you want to have some thoughts, share some thoughts with us? And Heather, hi.
Yeah, hi. Another Heather. I was hoping that it would be free. It would be something we didn't even think about anymore. Everyone would have free power, and we'd marvel that 20 years ago people actually paid for this stuff, and big wars were fought over energy, and the OECD held sway before that. Yeah, I think fuel companies will be history, and well, I hope, and we'll actually live up to that graffiti I used to see outside Camberwell Station every day on my way into school, which said free energy is coming. So there we go. We may actually see that in 18 years.
Maybe by 2040 or maybe by 2030. Who knows?
Who knows?
While we're still on the topic of, I guess, 2040, so that 18 years away, who am I going to call on? Mary, Lisa, Kevin, who haven't we heard from? Helen? Any final comments, things to think about? What do you think?
I
would hope that our appliances, everything that we need to power, we need energy to power, would be much more efficient. Legislation which basically tightens up all that, so people are not having to throw out things after 5 years when they break down. But I think we need a whole new system of longevity.
Can I put in a cheeky question related to that? And this is something close to my own heart as an architect and a certified passive house designer. So we talk about efficiency, but if, as Heather was saying before, if energy is free, is efficiency still relevant?
Well, everything is, because it still costs you to build solar panels, and batteries still have to be built, and everything, all those, the new energy system still has a cost. You look at electric vehicles now; they're becoming really so much more smart, and well, they are smart electric vehicles. But I mean, in terms of the old vehicles, the ICE internal combustion engines are inefficient, and for all a lot of moving parts and all the things we know about them, very highly inefficient system. But it should be, like, if we go to that concept of that circular economy, that things are related, they're valued, and reuse is the big is the big word for me.
Fantastic. And Kevin?
Yeah, I think the technology side of the solutions are probably quite achievable with the right policy settings. One of the big challenges is going to be dealing with the legacy buildings, vast numbers of poorly energy efficiency in the housing. We're going to have a lot of rentals, and what landlords are really incentivised to do anything about their old buildings. It'll be a huge challenge, and it should not be just a knock them down and rebuild. We can put all the star ratings we like on housing, and we've got seven star on the way, but we have a huge legacy of 1.5, 2-star houses there now. And what's the incentives to improve them?
Yeah, and that is particularly, like, I don't want it all to be about me, but well, I'm here. So I guess last year I actually did the Passive House Designer course, purely for that reason, because I am an architect, and I was a bit over buildings being theoretically well designed but never actually qualified. So who knows if it achieves? And a lot of the studies that have been done of buildings in particular show that even something that's supposedly 7 stars, when tested, is maybe 2 stars. So it's a theoretical model. So the reason I like Passive House is you go in and you pressure test the house to get the rating after it's built. So you know what you're dealing with in terms of a leak rating, I guess, of air in and out, and you know how to manage that. So it's a very efficient model, and they can retrofit, but it is quite complex. So we'd be better off building well now, is my thinking. I'm just thinking who has not contributed who may want to. Lisa?
So I would like to see a decentralised system. Like, we might not have to pay for our power because we're generating it ourselves, but I would like to pay, say, XYZ electrical company, my friend Joe, who works for them, to come and fix my things. And if I can't pay him, I design his garden or do work for him. Or there's this kind of local economy that we can work from, rather than paying these massive companies to get richer. I would like to see that be part of our power and our local systems as well.
So it's almost like, I think money came about as a way of bartering or trading. So maybe it's, as money goes abstract and everything's electronic and you never see it, maybe we go back to trading in bartering rather than in fictional money. Who knows?
In a localised system, there's potential for that to happen, but not in today's systems.
No. And I think that's the interesting thing as we talk about 2030 and 2040. So we're talking, TRPI is very interested in 2030. So 8 years, my daughter will be 14. And then, 2040, 24. So very different through the eyes of a child. And I'm quite interested as a mum, picturing my child and the world she's going to live in as a young adult, what it's going to look like. So I think there's some very interesting points there and absolutely fascinating. So the idea is I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to two things that TRPI is working on in terms of neighbourhood battery initiatives on the island, 2 grants that we got, and then we might have a short break and come back and hand over to Heather to give us some decent information to help us picture the future and where we might go and what might be at play now and into the future. But earlier this year, I think, Totally Renewable Phillip Island, along with Energy Innovation Co-op and Mondo, were successful in winning 2 grants from DELP for investigating neighbourhood battery initiative systems on the island. One of them is looking at a big battery that is being put onto the island to help stabilise the grid, and we're looking at how we can use a portion of that for community to share energy. So it's quite an interesting idea, and Heather, you no doubt can let us know later, but I have been told this hasn't been done before, but it may well have. So we're looking at how we work with basically a utility company owned infrastructure, but then have the capacity to feed in, say, excess solar off our own rooftop and reuse it again after daylight hours, or be able to potentially share it with neighbours or sell it. So there's some very interesting ideas at play there. So that's one of the grants that we're looking at the moment. They're just studies, I guess, feasibility studies with trial periods at the moment. The second grant is looking at Phillip Island particularly, but we're calling them pole mount batteries. So the idea is smaller batteries that could be located at the various village points on the low voltage power lines. So they help stabilise the power within that village, but they also potentially provide a way of villages trading energy. So individuals from households looking at how they can share energy or trade energy or introduce new tariffs or have a friendly retailer. So there's a lot of very interesting notions. And I think a lot of them feed into what I guess is being investigated by DELP and other groups as future issues, such as fires in East Gippsland and all of those problems. So we know there's issues of remote communities that can be isolated, and the notion of having community hubs that are secure with drinkable water and power and light and heating and emergency food that people can retreat to. So this is sort of not necessarily the apocalypse and the end of the world, but more just how we can build resilience into communities.
So Zoe, did you say that you have, is this to look into possibly getting a battery, is it, rather than having a battery?
The big battery is currently getting its planning permit through the minister. So that's been a planning process through council and the department. So there's some council land just near Gap Road, down from Wimbledon Heights, that council bought for a circular economy transfer station. So there is actually an application at the moment to put a large battery on that site. And it is that battery that we are currently doing a feasibility study in collaboration with Energy Innovation Co-op and Mondo to look at how we can use part of that battery storage for community. So community members don't have to put their own individual batteries in, essentially. So it's a feasibility study really at this stage.
Zoe?
Yeah?
AusNet Services involvement, I guess there's a bit of a cynic in me that says maybe there's a incentive for them to look at the battery system as perhaps a bit more economical way of dealing with the grid problems than simply upgrading the grid.
Yeah, definitely.
What's in it for them?
Yeah, well, I've had most of our discussions are through Mondo, but essentially it's the idea, to some degree, we're all in it together, right? So it'd be like saying, let's upgrade all of the phone lines when we've got mobile phones. So we kind of all know where things are going, and do we hold on to systems that might need to go underground, that might need to that aren't fireproof, that come down when trees fall in bushfires. So I think the grid network is there. It's something we can implement. This is my thinking, by the way. But how can we help stabilise it? And how can we then feed in local energy production and renewables without having to, in one step, upgrade the entire grid network? So that's something I'm interested in. I know in terms of, I guess, infrastructure and utilities and cost savings and maintenance, this is no doubt why it's being explored as a direction to put batteries as storage within communities and within grid systems to help those grids when they are under threat, I guess, of bad weather, of not enough supply. But we're also seeing with, I guess, solar power feed-ins that the timing of energy availability versus demand is not necessarily meeting up, because peak supply is typically at night. No doubt Heather will correct me on some of this. But solar will only produce during daylight. So, I mean, you'd know on the island that there's all sorts of interesting plans for solar gardens, solar farms, cogeneration to produce a lot of local renewable energy. And we actually did have a question that we put to Mondo recently that came from community, which was, if we can get enough sort of battery storage on the island to help balance out some of the generation of local energy, could we theoretically have our grid powered by 100% renewable energy that's locally produced and stabilised, and in effect cut the line to the mainland? And the answer was yes, we could do that if that is where we go as a community. So obviously, I don't know if we're talking 2040, 2030, 2050, but that's kind of what we're doing today. We get to shape this discussion, and we get to decide what we want to happen, what we want it to look like, what kind of futures we want, and how we want our energy and our settlements to function, I guess. Who here lives on the island apart from me? Bernie, Mary?
Lisa.
What we're talking about here, and the whole point of the grants, is using Phillip Island, because we're an end-of-line community. We're at the end of a power line. We're at the risk of supply problems, and how we can look at how you can help stabilise an end-of-line community. And we just happen to have the advantage of being an island geographically as well. So the notion, it's quite clear when you have a boundary to have an extent to play with. So whether or not we can almost trial precedents on the island that then can basically be extended. I mean, TRPI's mission is to extend what we are doing to other waterline communities anyway, because it's all about sharing the model. So the idea that we test and we explore here in the condition that we have on the island, and then we can actually share our learnings as well.
The other thing, just to add there, Zoe, about the big battery is that it will take away the need for AusNet to put in large generators, which it does every summer. That's happened the last several years, and even that in itself is not always enough to generate enough power for peak season. Plus, also it's not the sort of way we want to generate power. And at the moment, it obviously is going to be powered by the grid, that big battery, but with increasing amount of renewable energy going into the grid, that in itself should also, but when that will be achieved, I mean, but it is all about acknowledging the issues and starting the process of opening up the opportunities via this big battery.
That's exactly right. And I mean, Phillip Island, again, with our tourism and numbers and holiday, weekenders and summer holidays, we do see a lot of flux in the demand on the island. So it is a great way to start to look at what you do in extreme instances of needs varying enormously as well, and how we can help stabilise that and accommodate use that might triple in some months and then be scant in other months.
So Zoe, what's the solar rooftop panel uptake like on the island, especially for holiday house people? Is that another sort of challenge to try and
Off the top of my head, I don't know the figures, but I know we've looked at the moment for part of our Stream 2 grant, which is the pole mount batteries in the villages. We've looked at some of the data. We're actually, because it's a work in progress, we're getting data from AusNet as we speak. I signed a form 2 days ago requesting information. But we're looking at, in real, I think we're up to 30% solar. Cape Woolamai is not far behind, and I forget the third, but there was another village that had quite a similar uptake in solar as well. The rest are a little bit lower, but again, it's a little bit like some of the discussions we had about electric vehicles this morning in a chicken and egg scenario. You can get an electric vehicle, but you also want the infrastructure to be there. So for instance, it's very hard for us to keep asking people to put solar on roofs when tariffs are going down, and they may start getting charged to export solar if we don't have some way of storing that solar, so that we can actually say, put solar on your roofs because that will contribute to our energy capacity on the island. And we often talk about the idea that people who have weekenders here or might rent them out over summer could have solar on their roofs and potentially earn an income off their vacant houses by, exporting that solar into infrastructure that can be shared around the island. So who knows where this could go? And I think it's a very interesting world and a very interesting study at the moment. Fantastic. I'll see you guys very soon.
I didn't realise the island runs on diesel generation every summer.
Well, it glitches in and out, and I'm not quite sure how big the units are, but when it's seriously peak demand here, they will fire up, but as fast as they fire up, they get overloaded and drop out again. It's pretty hopeless, really.
Shall I just launch into it?
Please do.
Okay, great. So thanks, everyone. Really great opportunity for me to settle my thoughts and try and come to some conclusions. Now, I would love people to jot their questions in the chat as they come up. I'm probably going to fire through this fairly fast, and Zoe, you might need to ding me off if I'm talking too much.
Sure.
I could have built more slides around my battery knowledge. I didn't do that. I've recently done a report for Zero Emissions Noosa about batteries, so there is one slide in there. So feel free to explore that with me afterwards if you're more interested in that. And I could have built a talk more around community energy, but given that this talk was designed around starting an open slate and having nothing to predetermine what we discuss, a lot of the stuff I talk about with community energy talks about the models that have already been developed in the community energy system. And obviously Phillip Island are in a bit of a new space, and so it's important that you don't feel restricted to those business models. And as I go through my analysis, I didn't appreciate the generators each summer, so I don't have the data for that. So my data might be a little bit lacking, but it still tells a useful story. I decided once I realised we were having a chat about the future and what some great ideas that you all came up with there, I decided to add in a couple of my slides about my PhD. So let me get started on that one. You guys know this, right? And Ian talked about it there when he described the 2040 future as a network of microgrids. And that's what my PhD is exploring. I guess partly it's also exploring those two polarities, fully decentralized, fully centralized, but also the interaction between those two things. And, what does decentralized really mean? Because we're quite familiar with centralized energy. We've had it for an awful long time, although originally local governments set up their own energy systems. We've had state-based energy in Australia since the war, really. And so what does it really mean for so many aspects of electricity supply to fully exploit the decentralisation that's actually happening already? You know, we're getting solar, we're getting batteries, we are building out all these little tiny assets all over the place. What does it mean? And I'll touch on some of that today, but I also wanted to characterise our transformation a little bit. You know, after the war, we built electricity systems in an era that I like to refer to as big government. So the engineers who built the system were hard to challenge. That's certainly not the way it is now. More people know more about electricity now than back then. That very much an era of technical expertise, very much an era of when government really wanted something, it could put its hand in its pocket and build it, right? And we've seen a flash of the old big government recently with the $2 billion snowy pumped hydro announcements and things like that. Now, in the 90s, we went full on into big market. You know, the neoliberal era started, we privatised our electricity systems. That ushered in a lot of change. And it's part of why we are where we are. You know, maybe under big government, they would have said, oh, I don't like this solar. Maybe they wouldn't. But under big market, they had to say, well, everyone needs a level playing field. And when I did my Churchill Fellowship, it was really clear how advanced Australia was compared to other countries with household rooftop solar. And part of that is we had the solar resource and we are so lucky about that. But part of that is, like it or hate it, the renewable energy target gave the market a long-term signal way back in 2005, and it told everyone that rooftop solar had to have the same opportunities as all the other big renewables. And that has been a real key to driving uptake. You know, in other countries, people have to wait for tax incentives to be paid back and stuff like that. But we get our rebates up front, and that's part of the reason we've decentralised in that way. And it's part of the reason all the battery manufacturers see Australia as a testing market, because we've got the rooftop solar here as well. So that's part of why we've got a really good battery presence. As we explore the community scale stuff, you know, one of the things that's worth thinking about is how much is marketable, transferable, if you like, you know, that cookie cutter sort of idea, because that's what markets tended to do really well. They're always after efficiency. So if they could design something once and sell it 1 million times, that's what they love. How much of it is fair? You know, big government, when they built out the electricity system originally, they were aiming for access. Access to electricity was, for everyone that wanted it, was their sort of main aim. And in the back of our minds, we need to keep in mind that Australia, well, every country is unique in the renewable energy resources it has. So how much of Phillip Island's story becomes a unique story, but it's better to design these systems for what suits you, and how much of it is transferable around Australia. It's less likely to be transferable to other countries. If you sit in New Zealand, you realise that this New Zealand's a land of geothermal and hydro, whereas Australia is a land of wind and solar. And those two things really, really shape what sort of electricity system we get. Quite different from what we've been in the past, where coal, gas, diesel, all these fossil fuel electricity systems, you can go to another country and recognise their electricity system, because we've all built much the same things, probably with the exception of nuclear. Now, the other element to my PhD is about transition. Transition is messy. Transition is complex. Transition looks like it's not happening at all, and suddenly we're on the other side of it. So in the middle of a socio-technical transition, which there's a lot of academic literature about that, they say the whole transition might take 50 years and often does, but in the middle of that space, you see that classic photo of a New York street where you can't see the first car in the picture because the place is filled with horses in one photo, and 10 years later you can't find the horse because the place is filled with cars. And I feel like with our electricity transition, we're in that very rapid change part of the story. Some things to bear in mind about what happens during the rapid part of the transition. It's quite crumbly. I describe it as crumbly in the sense that for a little space in the rapid part, lots of different futures become possible. But as soon as the powers that be get hold of the future and have enough control over it, it has its own path. And this tree down the bottom of my diagram here is to remind me that when we look backwards, we just see the one path that was taken. But in fact, that path represents a lot of forks in the road where all these different options could have happened. And part of what we're doing in this part of the transition is we're influencing what that final decision path looks like. And the last thing, this triangle conditions of systems change stuff is there to remind me to talk about structure and how hard it is to structure things. And you guys came up with so many fantastic things. You know, Mary talked about the circular economy and repairability of appliances. These are deep in our systems and deep in our psychology, our sort of beliefs and our worldviews. And what changes first? Does the electricity system change? And because it's necessarily different, some of these deeper things change? It's hard to know. But, you know, there's some really interesting stuff here about how fundamental the change will be. And my answer to the question about is efficiency necessary is absolutely. If you look at how much smaller the solar output is for the resources that it uses compared to, you know, that dinosaur fuel that was a nice and concentrated, you know, if we don't get on top of efficiency, we won't be able to share the energy and the resources of the world properly and grapple with climate change properly. So I think efficiency is fundamental in all of this. Let's get on with it. I thought I would start with South Australia because this is where you guys are headed, right? So this was last week in South Australia. There are two yellows on the slide, but you can't quite see them. There's a little bit down the bottom here that is the utility solar, but the bulk of this is rooftop solar, pushing down our load, pushing electricity out to Victoria here. The purple here is all the electricity we bought from Victoria. And underneath here, this is the price going negative every time it happened. So you are bulldozing towards this sort of scenario in Phillip Island. In fact, every part of Australia is really bulldozing towards it. This is the South Australian uptake story. Even though we, on some days in October, can provide all of our electricity needs from rooftop solar, 327,000 installations isn't close to everybody. I've got 43% of homes here. There's about 750,000 homes in South Australia, but there's businesses as well, obviously, as part of that uptake. So I reckon over 60% of sites probably still don't have solar. And at the moment, they're incentivized to get solar. So this makes it really important. The conversation you're having today, maybe people don't need to get their own solar when there's lots of solar running around. Maybe they do. We're still a long way off. Is it on this slide? South Australia's actual solar consumption over the entire year is only 15%. So we need to grapple with how we move that solar around. Same graph, different location. This is Phillip Island. So up until last month, September 2021, you had 1,800 installations across the island, which, according, I've cross-referenced with your David Coots report for Totally Renewable Phillip Island. So that's about 38% of your homes and some businesses, right? makes that many. And overall, you've got 10.5 megawatts. So on the way, definitely. And you're heading the same direction as South Australia. This is a sunny week in October. I had to play with the data. I've only got the data up until 2020, and I had to play with 2019 for this graph. So it's not completely perfect. But you can see how the solar is pushing right down the electricity requirement on site at times. So I thought I would look at the averages and the day. So that, you know, the data I've got goes from 2008 to 2020, and you can see what's mainly happened. There's been a little bit of fixing some spike in the middle of the night, but they haven't taken it out completely. This is hot water. Down the bottom along the axis here is time of day. So midnight at this side of the graph, midnight at the other side of the graph, and all the way through the day here. So you can see the hot water spike at night, you can see the breakfast spike, and you can see the evening spike. I didn't know about the generators, so these will be slightly different with the generators. This belly in the middle of the day, which is getting deeper and deeper, that's your solar. So that this was 2009 at the top here. This one down here is probably 2020. That's your solar making more and more impact as each year progresses. So that is excellent to see. And it looks a bit like this. And just like South Australia, it's about 15% of your total annual consumption minus the generators. And this is another one of your challenges, is what month that happens in. So you're actually up from 15% to 23% in November. That's your best month. But in June and July, you're down at 6.3%. And that's because the sun doesn't shine as much in winter. So let's have a look at what could self-reliance look like for Phillip Island, because at the start of this show, Zoe sent me something saying self-reliance and sharing. So I'm going to grapple with both those things. Obviously, you're going to put in more solar. You might be quite incentivized to put in other forms of renewable electricity because they start to serve loads at different times. And you'll see in South Australia, because we grabbed the bulk of the early wind industry, we've got wind operating at a lot of times when the sun doesn't. Energy efficiency, I put on my slide because I think it's important. Plus, it's important for your community, right? People get to save money. And you do need to start preparing for new loads. There is no doubt in my mind that we will get rid of gas. I was surprised. I came to visit Hayfield recently because one of my microgrid projects is there. Well, I was surprised at how much bottled gas people run on in Victoria. That probably harks back to some old government policies to push cheaper fuel out into the country. So getting off gas will be bring on all those hot water heating, cooking loads. Electric vehicles can be huge, but they also may not be. So as Mary pointed out with the size and the efficiency and things, you know, if maybe we don't need to walk around with 500 kilograms of vehicle for a lot of our transport needs. Maybe we can use lighter weight vehicles, be much more efficient some of the time, and save the heavy vehicles for when we really need them. So, and the same with hot water. This hot water spike doesn't include heat pumps. Heat pumps use about a quarter of that electricity. So as we move it over, that's going to change. So those are some of the things you're going to end up doing with to achieve self-reliance. What could sharing look like? Some sharing's happening already. So when I map this solar, I'm taking all the solar that's produced, but half of that maybe, and maybe even more than half of it, is leaving people's properties and being used by another business or another house. And so what you find in an electricity system, and this works well for the argument for those rooftop pole-mounted batteries, is if everyone on the street all wanted to have solar, you would have too much for the transformer at the end of the street to handle. But because household load is diverse, you chew up some of the surplus solar from each other's houses, even when you've got solar yourselves. You turn on the kettles at different times, you do things at different times. Solar energy, solar output has less diversity. When the sun shines, all the solar panels work pretty well. You will get some diversity with the way solar panels are facing. Some of them are steeper, so they get more winter sun. Some of them face east and west, so they get they produce their solar energy more in the morning or more in the evening. But mostly solar energy is not very diverse. Obviously, you're going to try and create a solar surplus and use it in other parts of the day. You're going to need a battery to do that, and obviously your battery projects will help to really use up that surplus. Batteries are still quite expensive, so part of this conversation becomes how much storage do we need? How can we get the most at the lowest cost? Becomes how can we get the most with the smallest battery and lots of other cheaper activities that we're going to do. Shifting loads is going to become really important. Controlling those new loads and the ones you've shifted so that they can be as dynamic as possible. And there's a thing in South Australia now called dynamic operating envelopes. So what they're saying to new solar owners is you can connect to the grid, but unless you let me give you a signal to stop exporting at times, I won't let you export at all. And of course, up until now, we've run away saying I can size my solar system as big as I like because the grid will take my surplus. But people will be rather frustrated as the grid starts to take less and less of their surplus unless communities like Phillip Island put in place a culture and a narrative and some models as to how to accommodate sharing. And finally, I have added external renewables. So one of the big advantages of your big battery is going to be a link to the wholesale energy market. And a lot of the batteries on the market, the bigger batteries on the market at the moment, make a lot of their money out of frequency control services. I'll talk to that in a little while. But also, as a totally renewable island, well, maybe not so much you guys. Let me take you to Hayfield that doesn't have the wind resources that you guys have. In Hayfield, they might see no benefit in producing their own wind if they can actually buy quite cheap wind on the market when there's plenty of it, and it'll more or less do the same job, perhaps. Hayfield is still exploring exactly what they want, but that link to the external market, and, you know, in a sense, that's that polarity again, isn't it? Centralised versus decentralised, and what makes sense in both of those edges of the spectrum. So I wanted to emphasise also that sharing happens at different levels. So there's your substation in the middle of the island that I've stolen all this data from. In fact, when you click on these lines on the AusNet portal, it says that almost all the way to Surf Beach is fed from Wonthaggi substation, not from Phillip Island substation. So there's a level of sharing where if you do a good job of totally renewable and using your renewable assets, you can share some of that back this way. There's a level of sharing at the medium voltage. So these purple lines are your medium voltage 22 kV system around the island. And that's what your battery will do. So Mondo, I believe, will be putting the battery here at the substation location. That third level down that I mentioned with the pole top transformers at Surf Beach, let's say, at the end of this this purple line, there is a a distribution substation, it's called, or a low voltage transformer, a transformer that takes the 22 kV kilovolt system down to the 3-phase 415 volt or the single phase 240 volt that you are using in your home and that your home is connected to. And so there's going to be constraints. That's what we're seeing in South Australia already. There's going to be constraints at that substation level, that small substation level. The substation might be 100 kVA, which is equivalent to 100 kilowatts, or it might be up to 500 kVA maybe in the Cowes industrial estate, but it's relatively small compared to your zone substation, which I've got 26 MVA written here, 26 megawatts, but I suspect that's partly counting your generators, your summertime generators in that capacity. So we did a report for Zero Emissions Noosa, and I used that opportunity to look at all the ways batteries make money. I would argue that all these ways batteries make money are also available to other things like load shifting and moving your hot water into the daytime and stuff like that. And I think it's really, and I categorised them down. I boiled them down into behaviours. So let's have a look at this. And the one I'm mainly talking about today, which I think is most of the value, is matching supply and demand. And you could say, well, Heather, why don't you just take a value for middle of the day and a value for middle of the night and use those numbers from the wholesale electricity market? And my argument would be that those things are changing and they continue to change, but the underlying value that everything that is causing those prices on the wholesale electricity market is the fact that supply needs to match demand. And while it was easy in the past with a coal-fired power station, you just built more capacity and burnt the coal when you needed, it's a different equation that we're grappling with and getting our heads around now as we transition to this new electricity system. Not only does matching supply and demand make money in the wholesale electricity market, it also makes money in the capacity, the fundamental investments in capital equipment. So the size of the power station, at the moment, the electricity market works on the basis that, yes, there are still some peak demand times, and we run very expensive but cheap to run generators at those times. Like they might even crank up diesel, for example, at those times. That's to manage demand, or that can be also, that value can also be captured by managing demand. The other big capital expense is the size of those distribution transformers, the size of the wires, the size of your zone substation. Every time you trigger a new investment with AusNet services, you pay forever for that investment because you couldn't pull the demand down. So those sort of managing supply and demand, freeing up capacity for growth, for example, deferring investment, those are all things that come with better matching of supply and demand. The other four things, I would argue, once we get the assets in place to match supply and demand, you can also do these other things which are worthwhile. Now, a lot of the batteries that are being trialled around Australia are getting quite a bit of revenue, and they did it with the virtual power plant trials in South Australia as well, quite a bit of revenue from frequency control markets, FCAS, frequency control ancillary services. Now, what FCAS markets exist for is when something suddenly changes. So most of the time, the electricity system forecasts ahead, knows what the load's going to be, knows what the supply, and then books the right supply to supply that load. But occasionally, a coal-fired power station fails, or we have a big storm and a bunch of load is chucked out of the market, and we need the electricity system to respond quickly. And batteries are showing themselves to be fabulously quick at responding to frequency events on the market. So they're making quite a bit of money there. We're also seeing a lot of power quality issues, although I suspect that the network businesses don't know as much as they would like to know about the power quality in the very low voltage parts of their electricity grid. They don't traditionally catch a lot of data from those places. They respond to complaints. So if someone complains about their power quality, then AusNet services might go and have a look at it, but the rest of the time they might not know. And so your local work can do, especially if it involves batteries, can do stuff to improve the power quality. Obviously, we need to start talking about backup supply. That's what a microgrid can do. It's what your batteries could do if they are connected to do that. When you talk about backup supply, you might spend a lot of money for a little amount of time, or you might spend slightly less money, but also have some loads you could turn off. You could say, okay, only a quarter of my loads are essential. I will build a backup system or a microgrid that can island and serve a quarter of my loads, because it only happens 5% of the time or 2% of the time. And those are the times when I really value being able to do those essential loads. And of course, what we're seeing is a lot of drivers to invest in sharing or load activities or batteries, because of the value of bringing on the renewable energy revolution, speeding up the way we tackle climate change, all those things. So in Hayfield, we had a really good discussion this morning about local economics. And I think someone else here mentioned that in our vision stuff. You know, why not have a system that serves your community for more than just electricity supply, serves it for economic value as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about costs. I want you to understand how your pricing is stacked. So these graphs come from the regulator in Victoria. They're forecasting cheaper electricity prices next year, but a bunch of that is what it costs to produce the electricity, what it costs to pay for the coal-fired generators in the Latrobe Valley, for the wind farms, for all the generation equipment, and to run them. So, you know, typically a fossil fuel power station is half capital cost, half running cost, but typically a renewable power station is all capital costs, zero running costs. So important to understand some of that. Awful lot of your costs are the network charges. That's obviously what your battery project is aiming to mitigate, not only to develop some benefits for the Phillip Island community, but to also manage the costs that AusNet Services already has on the island. And then retailers, you've got two bunches here that are the retail and the retail margin. And so those organisations, which are often the same organisations as the ones that own the generators, so the Origin, AGL, but now we're seeing a bunch of smaller retailers, they're the ones who manage you as a customer. They manage your bills, they read your meters, they manage to get your money. That's part of what they manage. So, there's another big lump here for environmental, and that includes old feed-in tariff payments, the undergrounding of lines, chopping of trees so that they don't cause blackouts, things like that. So having a quick look, and this is worthwhile thinking of from the perspective of what does it cost to produce, and what value does it have for the person I'm going to share the electricity with? So, whoops, there we go. Wholesale energy comes to about 8.3 cents a kilowatt hour in your Victorian electricity market. Solar at the moment is starting to drive down to 5 cents a kilowatt hour in some places, right? So it is going to be one of the cheapest, and wind is the same, the cheapest source of electricity you can get. If you don't have to pay the network to deliver it to you, or you could argue even just the cost of delivery plus wholesale energy, you're in this 15 cents mark. So the value of doing local electricity starts to show up here. This is what business pay generally on average. So if you can generate electricity and use it already on site, and of course, one of the real benefits of your scheme is that you get to essentially move the meter a little bit around Phillip Island, so that you can say I think you're going to be given the opportunity to network tariff trial, which shows that you can work out what is the value of sharing locally before I have to pay to put it on the system. And residential behind the meter costs you about 33 cents a kilowatt hour on average. And right up here, I did add it in. If you're going to run backup generation, it's generally around 50 cents a kilowatt hour, even before you pay for the generator. That's just the cost of pumping diesel into that. So in some circumstances, it is absolutely worth having relatively expensive forms of electricity supply if they do a good deed for you. And from the Zero Emissions Noosa battery report that I did, knowing that everyone wanted a cost, costs are hard to predict. It all depends on how much you run the battery and how well you discharge it every single day. But there's a few costs floating around that come to around 27 cents a kilowatt hour. So thinking about that, if I say 27 cents a kilowatt hour, if your solar is worth nothing and you give it to the battery, it still costs you 27 cents a kilowatt hour to use that solar at a different time of day, for example. So that's how you will have to pay off the investment of the battery. And the way battery investments are evaluated at the moment, the battery manufacturers are giving things like 10-year warranties, and the 10-year warranties are premised on how much you can discharge the battery, and the idea that we'll only do that discharge, that full discharge, once a day. There's a great case study online from Queensland University who put all of their economics out for everyone to have a look at. And anecdotally, the manager of that said, I would have made more money if I had worked my battery harder. So he was bemoaning the fact that it took him a few months to work out how to really optimise that rather expensive investment that they made. I think they spent $1 million on their battery. So just recapping where we've been, these sort of activities create value, sharing value. Energy efficiency, when you're doing it, make your loads smart, flexible, controllable at the same time. So the idea being you're spending money on something like a heat pump already, think about the energy future and make sure it's smart, flexible and controllable. That's going to be the same story for your electric vehicles, and you're getting off gas loads because you're investing in them already. Shifting your loads is probably cheaper than chemical battery storage. A hot water tank is essentially a battery, right? But instead of holding electricity, it's holding hot water for when you use it in the shower later on. So there's a number of other forms of storage. Most of them are about thermal energy. I think, Zoe, you're the architect, but if you look at some of the European stuff, they talk about thermal storage in buildings. I think we will get savvier as we go forward with our building design to better understand how we can hold heat or hold cold to allow that comfort to be generated in the middle of the day when we've got surplus solar, but enjoyed all night long on a hot summer night. So you might generate the cold at lunchtime, and your house will stay cool until the sun comes up the next morning. Would be a great option. That's Zoe's design challenge from today. And I've put in smaller here, access to wholesale market incentives. That's going to be one of the smaller values from your big battery, but you as an island, Phillip Island, can think about, okay, that's going to become an asset for all the electricity users on the island. How do we use that as an asset? Now, just to finish off, and I hope I haven't gone too long here, you're not expected to be able to read this, but it's an interesting study that people use when they talk about business models. And I went through these 55 business models, so that they claim that almost all business models are a recombination of 55 main things, and they track back who invented the business model in 1910 and then show all the different businesses using the same business model along the path. And I went through those and picked out a few so that I could show you the way different business models are being used already in the electricity system, or the ones that we could think about as we go through the last part of our workshopping. So revenue sharing. The idea with revenue sharing is that to help Amber make revenue on the wholesale electricity market, they give you visibility to wholesale electricity prices, so you make some revenue as well, right? And Amber and Power Club both work on that basis. Power Club goes one step further because they are a co-op, so they're actually owned by their customers. So they're sharing the ownership costs and benefits with their customers as well, revenue sharing that way. And the virtual power plant trials were obviously all built around the idea that you have a battery, but I could make money out of it. So let's do a virtual power plant where you let me control your battery some of the time, you get some of the revenue, I get some of the revenue. There's a bunch of business models that are about how you play in the market as in your supply chain in the market. And I think Energy Locals gives us a really interesting example of that, because a lot of the new retailers have Energy Locals sitting behind them as the main electricity retailer. So that Energy Locals own the electricity license, but Amber do all the customer facing stuff. Oksami and Enosi are two new platform-based matching supply and demand models. They use Energy Locals as their base retailer. And even Indigo Power, which is the community retailer up in the Beechworth, Yakandanda area, they use Energy Locals as their main electricity retailer. So that's, from an Energy Locals point of view, that's Energy Locals doing a good job of understanding what part of the supply chain they want to play in and how they can create partnerships with other parts of the supply chain to do their business. And then there's a bunch of models that are around managing customer value, and subscription models come here too, like you subscribe to something and they guarantee what they provide you. You know, we subscribe to a magazine, they worry about what they provide you each month. In Alkimos Beach, which the businesses there are still government owned and they do electricity retail as well as networks. So in Alkimos Beach, and they've closed this trial, they charged an $11 a month subscription. So people were paying $100, $130 a year to participate in a battery, have access to a battery storage capacity. Some 80% of their customers saved money, but 20% didn't get full value out of that $11 a month. And they won't be repeating that trial because $11 a month wasn't enough to make the the battery cost effective for them. So that's the subscription model in action. Leverage customer data. I've heard this model talked about overseas when I did my Churchill Fellowship, for example. A lot of people going, hey, as we get these smart meters, we could understand when someone's hot water system fails, and we could send the hot water repairman before they've even got out of bed in the morning, right? So people are exploring how they can link the customer data back to things that they can sell customers. And the hidden revenue, I guess that's a little bit like leveraging customer data. How do electricity retailers actually find other ways to make revenue out of customers? Is it because they work out they've got a pool pump and help them get set up to control that pool pump to make it really cheap to run, for example? You know, so I think we're starting to see some of those things. There's a whole bunch of options that are around changing the base value of your kilowatt hours. I've put Sonnen here because they have a flat rate where they say, depending on the size of your house, you buy the right size battery and solar, and you just pay us a flat electricity bill. We'll manage all the rest, right? So that's about taking the customer risk in order to create a flat rate. A lot of business models are about paring everything right down to the bare minimum, the no frills. Freemium models and Robin Hood models are all about where you can afford to charge some customers a little bit more because they use discretionary, they have discretionary spending available to them, so they will buy the more expensive things, and that way you can give cheap electricity to other people who can only afford cheap electricity. And the add-on model, you know, that's where some of the airlines have gone these days, where you know, you can have the base price, but at every opportunity, I will take the chance on selling you something more. And I'm on to my final slide, everyone. I looked carefully at some of the business models around managing assets with high capital costs. Now, in a sense, this is what AusNet services do for you already. They're a monopoly. There's a lot of business models that are about creating artificial monopolies and locking people in. AusNet Services is a monopoly. They're not asking you to pay up front for your network. They're essentially doing rent instead of buy. If you leave, someone else can use your network, the network that you were paying for. They essentially use a bit of a pay-per-use model in the sense that they don't charge you for capacity on the network, they charge you for the number of kilowatt hours you use. And there's a couple of other fractional ownership and guaranteed availability models that also have been invented to deal with high capital costs. So I threw all those out there to stimulate a bit of a conversation, create a provocation. So thank you from me. I didn't answer any questions.
Fantastic, Heather. Thank you so much. Absolutely sensational. So I think we might, before we go any further, see if anybody has any not too in-depth questions for Heather based on that, because we do want to have a little bit of conversation time as well. I've got a few questions I want to run past you all. But did anybody have any queries they wanted, or questions or comments they want to bring up?
Heather, this is slightly related. I was just wondering about where individual solar house batteries sort of fit into the near future and the distant future, or whether that almost needs to be now leapfrogged.
So the ANU work, so ANU did a big battery study funded by ARENA, so there's a lot to read. My first I guess the first insight that I took from them, and I'm not sure how much it is generalisable or how much it really depends on that snapshot of when they analysed it, was that feeding everyone with individual household batteries versus one community battery, the community battery would only need to be about half the size. Maybe a bit more than half the size, but it it would end up being half the cost, right? The community battery could access these markets in ways that we weren't seeing household batteries do very well. And they can certainly access arbitrage on the market. So go with there might be a big benefit. We don't know very well how that market, how much dependence it is on those markets. The other interesting thing that they showed was they did some different algorithms on how to control the community battery. And they showed that you could do something really simple like a timer, and the value that had was that everyone understood how the battery was working. It didn't create as much revenue as if you set it for maximum profit, but maximum profit didn't make as much carbon emissions abatement as if you set it for carbon emissions abatement or community benefit, right? So you've got these different tensions in your business model about what you're really trying to achieve. And we start to get into this discussion of not really artificial intelligence, but, you know, control, management, decisions made by technology on your behalf are starting to have to respond to your values. And of course, we know that big market has some values like profitability and efficiency that might not serve communities. So that's why I'm really interested in the idea that we might get to move past big market, but maybe we're just dreaming. Does that answer your question, Helen?
Yeah. So if you had a shared battery, does that mean those people are making those sort of decisions, or it's not? It's the retailer or this.
You have to tell the battery what you want it to do. Now, everyone's going to be on a bit of set and forget, but if you look at what Yarra Energy Foundation is doing, I should have had a slide up here with the C4CE Knowledge Hub website, because there are some resources on there with some of the stuff that's being done. But Yarra Energy Foundation are working with ANU to create the control mechanism and the control algorithm, because they have asked the standard battery manufacturers, how will you control my battery? And the standard battery manufacturers have come back and said, well, we'll just feed it with the wholesale market prices and we'll optimise. They go, maybe that's not what my community wants.
Yeah.
So, once they've worked out how they're going to control the battery that Yarra Energy Foundation is building, they think it'll be around greenhouse gas emissions and community benefits. So they might look more to serve the individual householders to get best value out of their surplus solar, rather than looking to the market to just make a lot of profit.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks.
I think if I, jump in there and just say that's exactly sort of the discussion that we are having at the moment with our neighbourhood battery initiative, because we have entered a co-design process and TRPI is there representing community and actively will be seeking feedback and community input into how we want it to work, so that it isn't being taken out of our hands. We actually do have a say in how we want to use these resources and what we want that future to look like.
Zoe, have you had a chance to look through the questions?
I have. I know, Bernie, you have a lot of questions, which could take us, unfortunately, beyond our remaining 20-minute time frame. Did you want to choose one of them, Bernie, that you wanted to ask Heather now? No, there's a
lot of detail there, Bernie. Shall I just talk a little bit about frequency control markets, because I did touch on that. So there's quite a few frequency control markets, and I ignored the ones that are just about everyday matching supply and demand. And I looked at, and they're not producing much money for people. But the 6-second response and the 60-second response, and to a much lesser extent, the 5-minute response markets, those 6-second, 60-second are dominated by batteries. Lots of are applying into the market. So when you talk to Chris Wallen from Yarra Energy Foundation, he says, yes, it's there at the moment, producing revenue, but the more people that come in, the more the market pulls down. So we will get to some average results of who best has made the investment to serve that market. And we know the big utility batteries have made the investment to serve that market, less so what community batteries would necessarily make their investment for. So my sense is that frequency control markets will be much more of a local issue. In the virtual power plants, what they did was they said, you can't respond fast enough, but if something happens with the frequency, you have to respond anyway, even before I tell you to respond. So, and batteries can do that. They can watch the local system. And so if the whole system knows that it's got a level of responsiveness, they're telling generators to do it as well. You know, if we go over frequency, you should automatically back off a little bit and stop pushing so much electricity into the grid. So there's a level of self-control there that I think will come over time, and I think we'll see it in some of the post-2025 market design stuff that happens. And we're starting to see a real murmuring about local energy markets that I don't think the system has thought, you know, the regulators and the Electricity Security Board have thought enough about, but we're seeing it with Energy Consumers Australia and other groups like that. So, and all of these local initiatives. And so that's really quite hopeful for me that that will force people to start talking about it. Shall we take Luke's question? He's got his hand up.
Yeah, Heather again. So just, I guess from a practical level, what we had earlier this year on the island was an outage where we had power out for days on end. It wasn't summer, there was no solar. We really started running into trouble once the mobile towers went down. If we had a virtual grid, and I think I was talking to Zoe about this morning, wouldn't we all then hit up the grid and go, but we're all doing it at the same time? So how are these real life problems going? You know, I'm hoping they're going to be managed, because you can have backups, but sometimes you need backup after backup after backup, particularly given the severity of the climate change storms that we're getting. She says it's a thunderstorm right at the moment. You know, we might not be able to just switch over to power from South Australia because they might have had the same storm the day before. And, you know, these sorts of issues where, you know, they need to be fitted into this system, not as a we can just get power any time, but as a, you know, what happens when we can't?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a series of storms in the Adelaide Hills, and people lost power for up to 3 weeks. Not recently, it was straight up to the big state blackout, so everyone was on edge already. Yeah. And you know, the SA Power Networks started saying, maybe they want us to drive up with a battery in a box and plug it in, right? You know, and when the island was out for 3 days, you know, they could have told on day 1 or day 2 that, hey, run in the extra supplies, perhaps. I don't know. So there's those sorts of things.